Hello there, my name is Noah Giberson, and I'm here alongside my co-hosts Em.
Hi.
And Rob.
Hey there.
We are the hosts of Fax Machine, a podcast by and for people who are curious about everything, but especially the things that make them laugh. This time we are joined by neuroscientist André Pineda, PhD, who among other things is a science communicator, a science comedian, and a science Canadian.
Woo!
André, welcome to Fax Machine.
Oh, thank you guys so much for having me.
So, to us, you have been an integral part of the gritty New York science comedy scene. So, tell us, why use comedy to get people interested in science?
That's a great question. I think a great reason to use comedy to get people interested in science is because people like comedy, and you want people to like you and what you're doing. So, in general, I mean, I think that much has been discussed and written about how to get people interested in science. And you can't just shout facts at people. You need to hook them, whether it's through a narrative or through comedy.
Well, I just want to say shouting facts at people is very much like our business. So,
no,
It's our bread and butter.
I think you guys do a wonderful job of actually, creating a narrative and making stories and making people learn facts through fun and interesting and funny ways. I think you guys are doing it the exact right way. So it's educational. It's educational because it's funny and interesting and narrative based. So I think that's what people want to hear, and that's the kind of delivery mechanism that you need to get people interested in science.
Well, that's very high praise coming from you.
Yeah.
And you heard it here, folks. Don't send your kids to school. Just listen to the podcast. That's it.
So, in every episode, each of us shares one fascinating fact along with the incredible story behind it. And finally, we wrap things up with a pub-style trivia quiz loosely inspired by the theme. This week, our theme is paradigm shifts, fundamental changes in the basic concepts, approaches, and underlying assumptions of a scientific field, a term originally referring only to the natural sciences, but which has come to be applied much more broadly and probably to be overused. So, without further ado, Emily, take it away.
This week, I learned that the Semmelweis reflex, a term given to the human tendency to reject new information that contradicts dogma, norms, or, dare I say, paradigms, is named after a guy who was scorned by the medical establishment for suggesting a radical new protocol: washing ya damn hands.
I refuse to accept this.
Yeah, and in various ways, I think, as will become more evident as the story progresses.
Ooh.
All right, so to put this guy, whose name was Ignaz Semmelweis, and his story in context, here's a little quick and dirty, but actually
Squeaky
dirty.
clean.
Yeah. History of germ theory, which is basically the concept, the scientific theory that diseases are transmitted by germs. So, like lots of other now well-accepted theories, its history is littered with folks who made the right observations and understandably drew the wrong conclusions, and folks who made the right observations and amazingly drew the right conclusions, and then also folks who called all those previous folks crazy until the science irrefutably backed them up. So, inklings of germ theory have been around since antiquity, through the Middle Ages, with scholars from various cultures observing that disease spread through communities where people were sharing food or living spaces, and also moved around with people as they moved from communities with illness to those without. And they kind of ascribed the culprit of this to some sort of invisible seed that could be transferred from person to person through direct or indirect contact. And these ideas were later supported by a key advance in the 17th century, the microscope, whose invention allowed people like Antoine van Leeuwenhoek to see microorganisms, or as he called them at the time, animalcules, which is just so cute. But to see them, actually see these possibly invisible seeds for the first time, and speculate that these might be the conductors of disease. But it wasn't until the 1800s that germ theory really started to pick up. Not so much in that it was completely replacing the predominant competing theory that was miasma theory. So basically that diseases arose from inhaling a miasma or bad air that's let off by rotting rotting organic material. But
And that would be like, they're like, miasma. I can't breathe. Where's my inhaler?
Oh, miasma. Oh,
I so missed that. I
I was like, that was not worth it. And I finally got it. Oh, I'm sorry.
I had to double back for it. My bad.
get the albuterol. Miasma's kicking in. Okay, I get it now. So miasma theory was still like prevailing for actually a surprisingly long time, like up through the end of the 19th century. But still in that century, scientists made crucial observations in support of germ theory and then actually began applying those observations experimentally towards the treatment of patients and also towards public health efforts with some pretty compelling results. So one big player in this kind of like era of germ theory research was Agostino Bassi. So he determined that microorganisms actually can cause disease by demonstrating that a fungus that was afflicting silkworms at the time could be like scraped off of one silkworm to infect another one. So like the silkworms that had this would grow this sort of like white powder on their like, I almost called their wings feathers, on their wings.
Silkworms could have feathers. I don't know.
Why not? But the powder contained fungal spores, and then he basically figured out that was like transmitting disease from one to another. Another notable dude who I'm very excited to mention for a few reasons, but mainly because his name is John Snow, and he actually knew quite a bit, specifically about the transmission of cholera in London. So,
oh my God, just like season 8. That's crazy.
But by tracking outbreaks in London, like of cholera, he was actually able to isolate a water pump that was like at the epicenter of a bunch of cases in a neighborhood, and persuaded the city to shut this water pump down. And then cases actually dwindled like considerably after that. So this work was considered like one of the earliest applications of epidemiology, which is pretty cool for back then.
They never talk about the effects it had on the water pump economy afterwards. Like it was pretty bad. The whole industry.
There we go. But later in the 19th century, our understanding became more concrete with the work of Louis Pasteur in dispelling spontaneous generation of microorganisms. So, like, this was a theory that had been around also for many centuries preceding that, like, things would, like, living beings would spontaneously generate in places where they were not before, including things that cause disease. That's not true. But he also detected microorganisms in association with disease, and Robert Koch's studies of anthrax, from which he developed an experimental framework for establishing associations between germs and the diseases they cause in future research. So around this time, there are also a bunch of like so-called sanitary movements that were happening in cities like London and Paris, or basically like city governments were taking motions to improve public health in a way that was focused on building like sanitation practices and infrastructure. And also like later on we had Joseph Lister of Listerine now. That's his like kind of what he's remembered as. But he was a physician who began applying Pasteur's findings to medical procedures, namely by proposing the use of antiseptic and also pioneering aseptic techniques. But prior to Pasteur, even as all of these health-oriented social movements and disease-quashing efforts were going on, miasma theory was still the prevailing paradigm of how diseases spread. I'm just going to like emphasize paradigm really obnoxiously every time I say it, and I'm sorry. I can't stop myself. But
would you say that the idea spread person to person, or was it more like based on the area you were in?
It was kind of like a miasma.
They had something.
It was in the air at medical conferences, and then but it was in this scene in 1846 that Ignaz Semmelweis, our main character here, began his, what would in modern terms be kind of described as a chief residency at the first obstetrical clinic of Vienna General Hospital. So this clinic was essentially a teaching hospital where poor, underprivileged women could go to get like free treatment and have babies, with the caveat they'd be cared for by doctors or midwives in training for both of those professions. And Ignaz noticed pretty early on that there was a big difference between the two clinics. One was attended by doctoral students and the other by midwifery students. And that difference was the mortality rate. So in the midwife's clinic, the mortality rate of pregnant women was about 4%, while in the doctor's clinic, it was about 10%, due to a much higher incidence of, pardon me for botching this probably, but puerperal or childbed fever. But yeah, so childbed fever at the time was caught by women who had given birth, and they didn't really know much about it beyond that, but it was just kind of like a fever that they would develop, and that would unfortunately usually be pretty fatal. So the reputation of the doctoral clinic having a much higher mortality rate was so well known that, according to Ignaz's accounts, women actually begged him to be admitted to the midwives' clinic. And some of them actually opted to give birth in the streets rather than like chance at the hospital.
Jesus.
Yeah, so it was pretty bad, and that understandably kind of spurred him to set about trying to understand why these mortality rates were so different between the two clinics. So he progressively kind of ruled out all sorts of factors related to how each clinic ran and cared for its patients, including crowding, the temperature, in the treatment areas, like the birthing positions that each set of caregivers recommended. And at one point, he even rerouted priests who typically passed through the doctor's clinic on the way to give last rites to other patients, on the off chance the women simply seeing the priests stressed them to the point of fever, which, I mean, I guess, fine, you got to rule everything out. But also, these women were giving birth pre-epidural, or like any kind of like pain reliever, in a hospital that was gross and like probably going to kill them, as they knew going in. And I feel like a priest with like a little bell and some Eucharist wafers was not going to be the stressor that tips them over the edge. But anyways, as I mentioned, he ruled out all of these different factors, but at the end of the day, the only remaining one was just who was caring for the patients in each clinic, doctors or midwives. And when his friend, a pathologist who prepared autopsy cadavers for the doctors to study, died of an infection from a scalpel cut, he realized that the caregivers might actually be the problem. So as a little disclaimer to everyone, this is where it's going to actually get gross. Like, we've been talking about germs this whole time, but like this is where it actually gets.
Okay, I'll take these
gross.
off.
Let's get started.
Andre is recusing himself. We'll come back later.
Nope, no thanks.
So at this time frame, medical training began to prioritize kind of like students' scientific understanding of their medicine, which is cool, forward thinking into it. So as part of this, anatomical study with cadavers became a more common and like formal part of medical students' education. So generally at Vienna Hospital, students would operate on cadavers, as they do now, except with no gloves or PPE or anything, and like maybe wash their hands with a little soap or water if they feel like it, and then immediately go to the obstetrics clinic and perform pelvic exams and deliveries.
Boo.
Yeah, pretty bad. The midwives, on the other hand, were not doing that. So that emerges a pretty clear difference between like what was happening in each clinic. So Ignaz hypothesized that the doctors had, as he described them, cadaverous particles on their hands. Yeah, when they were.
Oh my god.
Yeah, I mean, I warned you.
Presumably, we're not talking about like an ear stuck on you. Oh god.
I'll just get here. Yeah.
Brush it off your shirt collar. Like, oh, sorry about that. It's my fifth one today. Like. But yes, so the doctors had, contamination from their previous cadaver work on their hands when they were performing procedures with their pregnant patients, which then gave the patients childbed fever. And he began documenting various cases of it in support of this, and actually eventually broadened his observations to like other diseases too. So like doctors would treat a different kind of patient, still not wash their hands, go to treat these women, and they would get and he instructed students to rub a chlorinated lime, basically a chlorine, like bleach adjacent solution, on their hands
like
prior to seeing patients.
Like lime.
Not like a
Get a lime, get chlorinated,
some lime.
No, lime, like the corrosive lime. Okay. But like mild enough, it wasn't like burning through your hands or anything. But I will say, like, if anybody out there kind of likes the grossness, a detail that kind of caught me about him like proposing this particular solution was that for basically experientially, it was the only thing that could remove like the smell from the students' hands. So that was why he settled upon that over soap and water, which was not as effective.
So still kind of stuck on the miasma smell.
Yeah.
If that's the only metric they had of like, you're clean when you don't stink anymore. So, things that don't make you stink are what cleans you. That's the best they can do.
Yeah.
Things that don't make you.
I'm I'm not an English major. Okay.
I feel like it's just the weakest soap commercial ever. If it doesn't make you stink.
Hey, you're good.
It's like Sand, the cheap soap.
Sand.
You'll smell neutral.
I do feel like it makes you not stink is like the red, what is it, Old Spice commercial version.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
they just yell something at you like Old
Yeah.
Spice. It
But
makes you not
this
stink.
is much older Spice. This is like middle-aged Spice.
Yes.
This is Victorian spice.
I mean, in that day, it was just rubbing spices on yourself.
There you go.
It was very much cover up the scent.
Exactly.
I don't think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I love the fact about Chanel No. 5, and like the famous perfume, right?
Yeah.
And one of its like things that it was advertised was like the scent of a woman, which I always thought was hilarious because surely the scent of a woman is what you're trying to mask. So
Yeah.
it always struck me as funny.
Be like, the odor of a body.
Yeah.
Like, nope,
No.
don't want that.
Just imagining like eau de bo, but bo is spelled Frenchly. That would just
Spelled
be
Frenchly.
something. Yeah. It's not the best description, but you can picture it. Like you can totally picture
There are a
it.
bunch of vowels in there that you just ignore, basically. That's how you spell Frenchly.
It's like the opposite of Welsh.
Oh my gosh, yeah. If you combined French and Welsh, you would never get past your first word.
I think you would, but you would have an even number of vowels and consonants.
Yeah. It's like matter and antimatter.
There we go. It balances out in the end. So as I mentioned, because of these observations, he instructed students to start rubbing this like chlorine solution on their hands after they did their autopsies and before they started seeing patients. And there are charts of childbed fever mortality data from patients before and after he implemented this that he maintained. And to look at now, they're pretty stunning. So there's a very clear dip like in the death rate in the doctor's clinic when Ignaz's hand washing came into effect. And the data is actually pretty stunning. So there's a very clear dip in the death rate with the institution of hand washing. It goes from like 18 to 2%, which makes it then equal to the midwife's clinic. So between the doctors and the midwife's clinics. And then there was actually another dip a year after that, which brought the death rate closer to 0 when he cracked down on students who were not adhering to his regimen. And then sadly, like with perfect accuracy, a year after that, a spike in deaths when he was fired from the institution.
He killed all those people?
Out of spite.
Oh
on
my
his
God.
way out. So this is where the story gets even more depressing, and where the Semmelweis reflex gets its namesake. So Ignaz, rightfully excited that this very simple change to medical procedure was saving a lot of patients' lives, began writing letters to the heads of maternity clinics and medical journal editors all over the world so other physicians could learn about it. And his students were writing papers and giving lectures about it too, though notably he himself didn't produce any literature until about like 10 years after his initial findings, which might have been honestly part of the problem that I'm about to talk about. So initially, there was some confusion and like misinterpretation by the medical community about what his findings actually were, but that was very swiftly replaced by strongly worded denouncement and discreditation by various big names. And I will say, looking at their criticisms, which are mostly just kind of like letters in response to these editors' letters and papers by his students and recordings of their lectures, basically the gist is they were just trying to poke holes in his ultimately like very empirical observations by claiming that theoretically they couldn't be backed up and discrediting how new he was to the field and that there was some, well, I'll just give a few examples, but it was just very silly, honestly. Okay. But things they questioned were that patients seemed to get sick from not only cadaverous particles, like he mentioned that he saw this happening with other patients as well, in terms of like doctors not hand washing in between. Okay, fine. That doesn't change anything, but fine.
Yeah.
Also that the patients didn't get sick, that did get sick, didn't present identical symptoms. And even prior to this, like patients with childbed fever, because it was more so was kind of like a spectrum of symptoms and like was not well characterized. This was not entirely surprising. And also just went after him because the ultimate cause of their disease was in his, theory still, as it was at the time anyways, like something invisible and uncharacterized. And this was all to kind of cloud his very simple observation that washing your hands results in fewer people dying. I did just want to mention one more kind of like comment with relation to the response to Ignaz's findings, just because they kind of like summarize what we discussed in terms of the real reason that the doctors were perturbed. There was an American obstetrician who was quoted to comment at the time, "Doctors are gentlemen, and a gentleman's hands are clean." So
Gross.
God.
yeah,
Very
that
nice.
is arguably the most toxic masculinity
So gross.
like that I've ever heard. So, anyways, but the rest of Ignaz's life after all of this is unfortunately really sad, to be honest. As I mentioned, he was fired. And he reportedly became like increasingly obsessive about his studies and how no one believed him. He took to attacking any physicians who spoke against his ideas like vehemently and publicly in the press. He became an alcoholic and developed what was maybe bipolar disorder from, like kind of retrospective diagnosis. And then ultimately was involuntarily checked into an asylum and died there at like 47. But his hypothesis was later confirmed by Pasteur, who actually did identify like specifically the microbial basis of childbed fever. And of course, his legacy has come to be honored now since. But anyways, his just felt like a story that was not only relevant to our current episode with the Semwise reflex, being about reluctance to adapt to shifting paradigms, but also, has many connections to our current times as well that I probably don't need to expound upon.
This week I learned about the paradigm shift about what is the center of the universe. So, you may all know that this is actually not about the real center of the universe. That came much later, but to break things down into terms that we're familiar with from like elementary, middle, and high school, there's the geocentric theory, which is that the Earth is the center of the universe, and that's because we're on it, and specifically I'm on it because I'm awesome, and so my planet is the middle of the universe. And that's what every individual is meant to believe. Or there's the heliocentric theory, that the sun is at the center of the universe, which I'm using in quotation marks here.
And is that meant to basically like the people on the sun are actually way cooler than us?
Yeah, I mean...
So to
Actually
speak,
way
because
hotter.
yeah.
The hottest people in the world. Wait, no, universe.
Universe, yeah.
But so this was the big discussion. What's the middle? Which is a really interesting problem because, as we'll see, the idea that your senses cannot be fooled, or that your sensory perception is the truth, which is a big field of epistemology and learning about the truth. It looks like the Earth is standing still, right? If you look, the Earth is not moving. So we're going to talk about how geocentric theory fooled a lot of really smart people for a very long time. So we can trace geocentric theory way back. It's basically was the default belief. In the absence of thinking about it, you believe the big rock you're standing on is the most important rock in existence. But the first person to really lay out a theory about it and all the observations of space and the world was Ptolemy. And Ptolemy was totally wrong because the Earth is not the center of the universe. But he laid out this really detailed geocentric theory in his book, The Almagest. And that's where he takes all his observations about astronomy and the movement of the Earth and the observations of the sun and stars, and he lays them out in this mathematically kind of beautiful series of observations. And so even then there were critics looking at the work that he did, where so using the Ptolemaic geocentric theory, you could extrapolate where's Mercury going to be in a year. Like, when will the sun rise in a given time? So it was a very robust mathematical theory. It just didn't describe what was actually happening. So Pythagoras himself, who was a big proponent of the Earth moving, something called geokinesis, but didn't necessarily think that meant it couldn't be the center of the universe, he had his critiques of Ptolemy, and another guy named Aristarchus of Samos, who I think is basically lost to history, except he was the guy in the 3rd century BC who proposed what we now know as the heliocentric model of the solar system. He was like, sun's in the middle, everything else spins around it. look how neatly this works. And literally everyone was like, nah. And like it worked so much better, but no one believed it because there's so many things about it that seemed hard to believe. And so there are other things, like other beliefs at the time. One guy named Heraclides said there was an Egyptian system in which the sun went around the earth, but Mercury and Venus went around the sun. So like weird how like there are mini orbits around bigger orbits, but like just not the correct model. So Ptolemy understood like there's no way to prove he was right? If any mathematical model, you could make the numbers fit what you observe, and that doesn't prove that they're correct. It just is a possibility. Something that like modern statisticians go nuts telling people as they look at data nowadays, that just because the numbers work doesn't mean it's true. But so his razor, his way of thinking about it was, if it's the simplest possible explanation, that's probably the true one. So even though he had this complex model, it was consistent throughout. It could be explained by a common set of rules. So if you're Ptolemy, here's what you thought. One, the Earth was a sphere. This was a given. This was always a given. As we talked about like many podcasts ago, flat Earth didn't really become a big thing until Washington Irving in like the 1800s. So like no one was like, well, if it's flat, that makes this really hard. It was not even a problem. The Earth was a sphere. Point two, everything in space is also a sphere. So the sun, the moon, all the stars, they're just different size spheres out in space. Very good. Number three, anything that moves in a circle because circles are perfect and so is everything.
I was with him up until right then.
I mean,
It makes me think of like the parody of like physicists who try to like break down models. Like assume it's a sphere, assume everything moves in a circle, and then this model works perfectly.
Yeah.
and like it like, but yeah, it's kind of like. I mean, it's definitely an idealistical model because you think of the glory of space and like how it has to be perfect, which is like really beautiful, and like it's a kind of almost religious view of the universe. But I can't help but think about Emmett from the Lego movie, and it's just like everything is circles, just like walking around.
That's not a reference I
To
get.
be clear for the listeners, Rob was dancing out the song. Everything is awesome, but his circle interpretation of it.
The man commits, you know?
Yeah.
Commits to the bit, even when he can't see it.
And for
You just know
Noah,
it's happening.
the song is "Everything is Awesome," and there's a little Lego man who dances around because everything is awesome.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's a great. You and Emmett would have a lot in common, Noah. I think
Oh,
you'd
yeah?
really connect.
Yeah.
No, just click.
Yeah. Yes, you do.
Just snap together. Sorry. And the fourth thing that Ptolemy believed was that the Earth did not spin. The Earth does not rotate or revolve on its own axis. And he was adamant about this. And why? What's the single best piece of evidence that the Earth doesn't spin? Do you guys want to guess?
It doesn't seem like it's spinning.
You can't feel it.
Oh, because we don't fly off.
Okay, that would be a really good piece of evidence as well.
Poor Ptolemy.
Yeah, he was stuck on the fact that the Earth is really big. He and his colleagues had calculated the diameter of the Earth, which is a huge sphere, and he knew how long a day took. And he was like, if we were moving at that speed, which by the way we are, his claim was it would be so windy, you guys. The wind would be ridiculous. And this was his entire reason. Like, it can't be true. It's way not windy enough. And like no one could convince him otherwise. And so everything close in his model worked. Actually, the sun, all the planets, they behaved according to his rules. The problem was other stars. So for the other stars to work, he assumed they had to be 20 astronomical units away. An astronomical unit is the distance from the Earth to the sun. So just for reference, the solar system is about 90 astronomical units to like the edge of the heliopause where like its gravity kind of matches others. And so he thought all the stars were like where Jupiter is. And everything else was much, much closer.
What a dummy.
And like it's hard to put in context like how you could have known that, but Aristarchus, the other guy with his heliocentric model, was like, no man, they've got to be like at least 2,000 astronomical units away because they're so different and far off. And for reference, the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, is 200,000 astronomical units away. So even that guy was like super wrong, but he was 2 orders of magnitude closer. So that's where like kind of astronomy stopped at around the 3rd century BC. For like 2,000 years in like Western thought. Jesus happened, Rome happened, some other stuff. And really, like, if you read Western textbooks, it's like the medieval scholars started looking at maps and things, and then like Copernicus happened. In reality, what happened in the year 700 was super important, and that was when the Amalgam that was written by Ptolemy was translated into Arabic, because it was basically this huge book of all the like recorded thought of astronomy, and it was introduced to an entirely new population of Arab scholars. And they went fucking turbo with this because they basically they just took it.
That is the best description of that I've ever heard.
But they went off and they're like, hey, wait, like we found this and look at that and we can improve these models, and like they were
like, hey guys in Europe, like, are y'all interested in learning a little bit about what we're discovering? They're like, nah.
Sorry, we're good.
We already established the Earth doesn't spin.
Yeah.
There's no need for you to look further into this.
Look at the wind,
don't
people.
rock the
Look
boat.
at the wind.
Come on.
This case is
You ever
closed.
heard of Ptolemy? Okay, because Ptolemy said it doesn't spin. So if you're putting yourself on the same level as Ptolemy, he's pretty famously a pretty smart guy. Okay,
Yeah.
No need to question it.
Yeah, he's a regular Archimedes, this Ptolemy guy. But so they really like they developed so much astronomical wealth of knowledge, and all of their work they basically this group of Arab scholars for 300 or 400 years who like are not really well known in Western scientific histories. They redeveloped like aspects of trigonometry and algebra, the way that we measure like spherical coordinates. They revolutionized the way that astronomy would be discussed, and it heavily influenced Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, and Galileo, who all owned all of the books and the writings of the Arab scholars. And there are so many that like we could do a whole episode about, but one to name, Ibn Al-Haytham, who's known as the father of optics because he was the guy that like really started making lenses that could do amazing things, and he used them to develop telescope lenses first because he was an astronomer. But he's credited with developing the scientific method. Like he's the first guy that was like, here's how you do an experiment rigorously. Here's how you like do trials to like see that it's repeatable, and like talked about what we now consider like power. And like to think that's a name that like I learned today. Like I was today days old when I heard this guy's name, and it's crazy. But so they were going through this absolute renaissance of thought, and it was literally because just the books of the earlier scholars hadn't been translated into Arabic until that time. So there were astronomers working in medieval Europe, and they were actually making advances and figuring out, oh, there are some flaws in this Ptolemaic geocentric theory, and they actually like brought up these problems to their Scala and like usually monks and monasteries studying this. But the problem was like they were predominantly Christians studying it in Europe, and a lot of monotheistic religions like predicated the Earth as the center of the universe. It was like very important, and actually was the basis of moral theology in some cases. Like, because the Earth is the center of the universe, therefore this about like the way that transfiguration could happen, or the assumption into heaven. And like if you said suddenly, nah, it's just a random spinning rock, like that would cast doubt onto the whole like dogma of the church. And so they were like, we must be making mistakes, or there's a mistake in the constant in this calculation. But so based on the work of the Arab scholars of the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, Copernicus started to write his geokinetic and heliocentric theory. So again, geokinetic being that the Earth is moving, it is in motion, and heliocentric, that the sun is the thing that's stable at the center. So he published that in 1543, and it was met with immediate criticism, a lot of which was not entirely religious. There was religious criticism, but there were also like mathematical criticisms and observational criticisms, things that couldn't be explained because one thing that actually is really interesting, if the Earth is moving that much, the argument was that stars should shift in relative position to one another in something called parallax. As we move from the opposite ends of our orbit, we should get two different views like we get with depth perception. And that was never observed. And so what's amazing is the person who explained that away was way back in the early days. Aristarchus, he was like, well, they've got to be so far away that it doesn't matter when you're on one end or the other. But even in Copernicus's time, that was a big problem. People were like, stars are not that far away. He was really smart to say, like, stars do move relative to one another, but so insignificantly we can't see it. And now in the 20th century, we have like really powerful telescopes and like the ability to kind of set standards to tell that they're moving like just thousandths of a degree, or like an arc second, basically, and we're able to see those really slight changes. So yeah, he was like, I mean, that's the 3rd century BC. He was really like a big thinker for his time. And not one of the most famous names. But so Copernicus wrote his book, 1543, basically set all of these things out. He laid out what the heliocentric theory was. And people criticized it. Galileo was an early critic of it, actually, but he got really into the math behind it. And so by the time Galileo was doing a lot of his writing in the early 1600s, the church had already banned Copernicus's book, and then they went back and like a republish was made where basically it said like, this is a hypothesis but not the truth, because the truth is this other thing. So they were able to kind of like, it was allowed to be published in like Christian countries because of that like rewording. So in 1616, under the Roman Inquisition, Galileo was never questioned. So that's the first time that the Roman Inquisition met up with him, but he was given like an explicit warning because he was studying space not to espouse heliocentrism. And he was like, yeah, sure. No, I totally don't believe that. Oh, that's fine. And so they just kind of let him go. And so you may, like, there's this narrative that Galileo was dogged by the church for 20 years to, like, give up. In reality, in 1616, they told him not to do it. They kept an eye on him throughout their Inquisition. And then in 1632, he wrote a work titled Dialogue on Two World Systems. And Pope Urban VIII ordered another investigation into him, and this one led to a prosecution. So the normal methods, there was basically an interrogation where they hoped to get a confession. And that's really the entire game in Inquisitions. If you're ever caught in one, they're just trying to get you to confess, because once you confess, then you're guilty. But the problem is with heresy, if you don't confess, then you actually haven't done anything wrong, because it's all thought. So it's really hard to charge someone with a heresy unless they confess. And so the
basically
cardinal...
don't talk to the cops is what you're telling me.
Exactly. That's my best advice.
All right.
But the cardinal inquisitors were like, well, we can't actually charge him with anything, so we're going to make him think we have a case against him and then try to get a plea deal. And so the plea bargain was that he had to admit to going too far in his defense of heliocentrism without saying he ever believed in it. And so Galileo took that. He agreed, saying that he argued for heliocentrism in a debate in a book, and he was so masterful a debater that he oversold the losing side and like out-argued the champion, which was geocentrism. And with that, they pretty much let him go.
I'm so interested in your like almost like procedural legal drama depiction. It's kind of like canon Law and Order.
I mean,
second episode in a row we've made Law and Order puns about the science we're talking about.
I know, we're setting a dangerous precedent, but I think but I mean it really is, though, because there were like strict rules that they had written about how to interrogate people, which they like clearly like didn't adhere to all the time. But Galileo was a big enough name with enough kind of wealthy patrons that they couldn't go off procedure with him. But basically, he was convicted of, quote, strong suspicion of heresy, which is not heresy. It's basically, so he was convicted. He was convicted of other people thinking he was a heretic.
Wow.
But they couldn't actually charge him with heresy, and so what happened was he was arrested for one day and then basically put under house arrest, which he was under for 9 years until he died. He was never tortured, even though that is, like, in canon law, something you're allowed to do. But the Pope decreed the interrogation should stop short with the threat of torture. And so that was Galileo's life, and the church did not accept the heliocentric theory. And so let's pass a little bit further into history to talk about the actual paradigm shift, because at this point, a lot of smart astronomers and scientists are accepting heliocentric theory, Church is really strongly against it. They're like, that can't be the way, no way. In 1758, the Catholic Church dropped his book from their banned books list, so it was no longer the index of forbidden books. Without explicitly saying that Galileo wasn't a heretic, just like his book's like okay to read now, they did it really quietly. And actually, it got a really public. There's a really public issue in 1820 when someone refused to print it in a Christian press because it was on the banned book list, and the church had to be like, "No, actually, it's not. It's okay." So that was like a little embarrassing. And then in 1979, Pope John Paul II held a council to basically call theologians, scholars, and historians to revisit Galileo's case. And see if there are any recognition of wrongs from whichever side of the case. Basically, he wanted to exonerate Galileo, it seemed like. And for 2 years, this council of scholars studied it and came back, and they were like, seems legit. So they did not exonerate Galileo. And so he gave like a really awkward speech where he was like, he seemed like a good guy, but he's a heretic. And like that was it.
What
and
are
then
you going to do?
He tried again like 10 years later, where he gave a speech that basically said the work of Galileo was foundational to understanding the universe the way we know it, and theologians of the time were not open to such a thought because they misinterpreted how his work would affect people of faith. And so they were defending the faith, but Galileo was factually correct. And that's kind of where the church left it. Cardinal Ratzinger has done a few, Pope Benedict XVI has done a few things in favor of Galileo without also exonerating him. But
he was also at some point head of the Inquisition, or what the Inquisition became.
I mean, he was a hardliner for sure.
No, I mean that was his actual position. At some point, I think it was I can't remember the exact name of the office, but he whatever the institution of the like the Inquisition became.
Oh wow!
Like evolved the official, basically they kept getting shuffled around an office building. And like one of his positions was the head of that. So he was the prefect of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is formerly known as the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, which was the historical Roman Inquisition.
Wow!
Whoa!
Yep. That was
Deep cut.
81.
I didn't expect
1981, the Inquisition.
I didn't expect that, but no one ever expects the Roman Inquisitions.
No.
Yeah.
There it is.
This week I learned that the modern idea of extinction wasn't scientifically established until the end of the 18th century and wasn't accepted until long after that. So if you were an educated person in the 1700s, you probably believed that nature was basically the same as it had always been. There were a bunch of species, and they had existed in the current form since the beginning of the world and would continue to exist in the same form indefinitely. So some of them could be driven out of an area, but they still existed out there in nature somewhere. So people at this time, say in the 16th century or before, and a long time before then, had seen fossils, right? So fossil collecting was a cool thing to do, but they didn't know that fossils were necessarily the remains of living things. They were just really cool shaped rocks that were fun to collect. So it took until the 17th century for many scientists, or what would then be called natural philosophers, to establish that fossils probably came from living things, because they sure looked similar to living things, and they looked like they had signs of having been living and doing stuff. But matching random old bones you find in the ground to each other or to living creatures is actually really hard. It's still hard today, which is why, for example, there's still so much debate over like how many species of Triceratops there actually were.
Matching all the dinosaur fossils could be claw and order.
You're just layering them in.
Should I just go all the way and say claws in order? Something like that.
Claws.
I mean,
Very nice.
So speaking of fossils, you can imagine if you have a worldview where everything that ever lived is the same as everything that still lives, if you find an ambiguous bone in the ground and you can interpret it as coming from a living creature, you're going to take that interpretation. You're not going to say, this femur is slightly longer than I expect, so let me overthrow my entire worldview. Unless, of course, you are Georges Cuvier. Cuvier was a wee French lad who had always had an interest in the history of the Earth.
French lad.
Oh, he was just a tyke.
A wee Frenchie.
Or a teak, as they might call him. So by luck, when Cuvier was in his early 20s, he got to know a well-known physician named André Alexandre Tessier. And Tessier was very impressed by Cuvier's genius, and he wrote to his friends back in Paris, quote, "I have just found a pearl in the dunghill of Normandy," which is probably still how Parisians think of other parts of France.
I also just want to say, Andre, that is the only good French pronunciation we've ever had on this podcast.
That was Canadian AF.
Well, if
Nicely
you guys
done.
need me to dub your episodes whenever you need to pronounce a French.
I actually have a few
Ooh,
French
I like
ass
that.
names in the quiz that I might need you to pronounce for me, so I'll send them over to you when the time comes.
Okay.
But we could go back to like episodes 2 and 3 when Emily had a real density of French names and just dub it over with Andre. That'd be great.
That'd be great. It won't be distracting at all. Just going from here to
Yeah, Emily had a cold for that word.
And a penis.
So Tessier met Cuvier, and Tessier hooked up Cuvier with his more established science friends. And Cuvier quickly rose up in the ranks and started doing research on comparing fossils to living species. So he had access to skeletons from different elephants or alleged elephants from around the world, and he studied them to try to understand how they all fit together. By looking at the skeletons of African and Indian elephants, he was the first person to realize that they actually were different species. So it's not just one type of elephant. Different elephants are different from each other. He was also comparing those skeletons to the skeletons of mammoths and what he would later name mastodons. And he realized that none of these things are the same species. Mammoths and mastodons were not the same as living elephants, so they must be extinct. Maybe it's inevitable that elephants were the catalyst for the theory of extinction, because it's easy to say this seashell fossil must belong to some shellfish that we haven't seen yet, but it's hard to say this mammoth fossil belongs to a species of mammoth that we haven't noticed. You would notice a mammoth.
I mean, it would be the elephant in the room.
Exactly. So basically, yeah, if there's a fossil of a mammoth and you haven't seen that mammoth, it's probably not around anymore. So in 1796, when he was 27 years old, Cuvier published a couple of landmark papers, one of them about elephants, mammoths, and mastodons, and the other one about Megatherium. Megatherium is another elephant-sized creature that's not an elephant. It's actually a giant ground sloth, an elephant-sized sloth. That's not relevant to the story. I just find that amazing.
No, it's awesome, and I think that's the one that basically was the animal that was responsible for the current day range of the avocado plant, other than the sort of the native range of the avocado plant, because a lot of seeds a lot of plants have seeds that in fruit that animals will eat and then will be excreted wherever they move to. And you think about how hard that would be with an avocado pit.
Yeah.
And you need a really large animal.
Big animal.
And so one of the thoughts is that the avocados would be eaten by giant sloths, and then they would just sort of lumber around somewhere else, poop out their big sloth avocado poop seed thing, and then that would become another avocado tree. And so it has something to do with the range of avocado trees in the wild, or avocado plants in the wild, is the range of these sloths.
But I feel like if you're counting on a sloth to carry you a long distance, you're probably not going to be that successful.
It's one at a time. You just take it one poop at a time. All right.
That's how you live your life.
This also came up in virtual trivia a week or two ago, that the animal that can hold its breath longer, is it sloths or dolphins?
Is it sloths?
Yeah, the answer is sloths. And it's a factor of 2.
Wow.
We were hypothesizing why this might be the case. The sloths can just hold their breath for a really long time. I don't know who found this out or
how. Are they too lazy to breathe?
slow.
Is that what's happening?
I think
They're
it's
just taking breaks.
I think it's literally they use so little energy that they just they hibernate between meals. But so
That's
I have
interesting.
an alternate theory, which is that, and this is completely unfounded.
It's never a good start.
But the things
This is an episode about paradigm shifts. We do not consider alternate theories.
Ophiocentrism.
I'm about,
Alternative fax machine.
but no, this is the paradigm shift in sloth
Shadow podcast.
in sloth breathing that I'm going to introduce to the world.
Wow.
That the things we know about sloths is that they take very big poops, and that they can hold their breath for a long time. And I think
So they have to hold their breath. Is that what you're saying?
they take a huge poop and then they slowly move away from it, and it takes them so long to move away they have to hold their breath.
Boy.
It's a defense mechanism.
Yeah. And then roughly 40 minutes later, when they're like 6 to 10 feet away from the poop, they take a big breath.
That's really funny.
Oh, look, an avocado. And the whole cycle starts again.
Why do I do this to myself?
Well, you know why. This is the stupidest thing I've ever said. You ready? You know why sloths don't have homes? Because they're obsessed with avocado toes.
Oh. Because they're millennials and they can't afford homes.
Yeah, that was probably in a ranking of one of the dumb things. I like the effort.
Also, shout out to Emily Mercer, PhD, for the sloth lung holding fact,
Nice.
breath holding fact. Yeah.
Lung holding.
I got one.
I can hold these for so long.
It's like the Vikings used to do.
All right, sorry, Andre, go ahead.
Okay, where were we? We're talking about extinction. So, yeah. So basically, George Cuvier encountered these extinct animals, or discovered these extinct animals. So what happened to them? Well, Cuvier and other people at the time had studied how layers of Earth look different from each other, which is called stratigraphy. Basically, as we now know, as you get deeper in the Earth, you go further back in time. And there are distinct layers of Earth that are built up over different geological time periods. So different layers also contain different fossils from animals. So you can see if some animal existed during one time period and then suddenly disappeared in the next time period. So they suspected that the Earth went through periods of relative stability and then sudden catastrophe changed everything, wiped out the species, and let new ones show up somehow. This is not too hard to believe because the idea of a biblical flood was pretty baked into everyone's consciousness. So basically the idea of a global catastrophe is already kind of widely accepted culturally, even by non-religious people. And this narrative of the history of the Earth, that there are long periods of stability and then sudden changes due to global catastrophe, is appropriately called catastrophism. I want to read one quote from one of Cuvier's landmark papers, which is this, quote, "All of these facts, consistent among themselves and not opposed by any report, seem to me to prove the existence of a world previous to ours, destroyed by some kind of catastrophe." How fucking awesome is that? The existence of a world previous to ours destroyed by some kind of catastrophe. That is hard sci-fi that he is writing about the actual world that we live in.
Yeah.
Over time, Cuvier established more and more extinct species from the fossil record, and extinction became more and more accepted. But catastrophism was basically rejected in favor of gradualism, which you can imagine means change happens gradually, and individual species go extinct, but they do it one at a time. Over this period of time in the 1800s, people were realizing that the Earth is not 6,000 years old, but actually millions of years old, and so long, gradual changes could explain all of this geological and biological turnover that we were learning about. You don't need a sudden catastrophe to explain big changes because the change can happen very slowly over time. And who's ever seen a global catastrophe? The catastrophes that Cuvier theorized about were, by definition, things that nobody had ever seen, and nobody, including Cuvier, could explain them. So scientists at the time dismissed catastrophism as being based on miracles like the biblical flood and not based on observable facts. Global catastrophes just didn't happen. Surely there were no historic events that suddenly wiped out large parts of life on Earth. That would be a crazy idea. So Cuvier got absolutely dunked on by his contemporaries. And
His contemporaries just went turbo on him.
oh my god. So one of his ideas, extinction, survived, but catastrophism did not. And amazingly, the idea of gradualism reigned supreme for almost 2 centuries after that, until 1980. So that, in 1980, is when a father-son duo named Walter and Luis Alvarez published a paper suggesting that an asteroid caused the sudden end of the Cretaceous period and wiped out over 70% of Earth's species. So the idea of an asteroid wiping out most of life on Earth was a crazy idea in 1980 that was hotly contested. But in 1999, the crater from the asteroid impact was identified, and that pretty much put the debate to bed. So yes, global catastrophes do exist and wipe out most of all life on Earth, what are now called mass extinctions. It turns out that extinction does happen gradually and slowly until it doesn't. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the history of Earth, and now with humans killing everything they can get their hands on, we are now seeing the 6th mass extinction. And not coincidentally, the book The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert was the inspiration for my fact today, and is great, and you should pick it up and read it. So the reason this story stood out to me is because I think it's amazing that Cuvier basically established the existence of new unseen worlds that were distinct from anything that humans knew, and I can't imagine how hard it would have been for people at the time to accept. It's a crazy idea that there are past worlds with completely different life forms on it than the same Earth that we think of as ours. But I think even more interesting is that at roughly the same time, there was another world-changing idea developing that Cuvier refused to accept, that is evolution. So Cuvier was colleagues with a guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And we usually, so biologists know this name. We hear about him in our classes as Darwin's dumb predecessor. But at
Speaking
the time,
of dunking,
Giraffes are probably pretty good at it.
Because they practice.
Yeah.
At the time, Lamarck was the first person to put together an actual theory of evolution. So he was a leader in this field, arguing that life on Earth evolved through biological processes and new species could arise from existing species. He also thought Cuvier was a dummy, and his ideas of animals dying out was definitely wrong. He thought species can adapt to new challenges. They can evolve and change, and that's why current species are different than old ones, not because they all died off, just because they change into a new form. And Cuvier, on the other hand, thought Lamarck was a dummy, and evolution didn't make any sense. Cuvier's expertise was in understanding animal anatomy and how all the pieces of an animal fit together perfectly, which is why he was so good at recognizing different species from their fossils. One of his main scientific principles that helped him to identify all these species is that different parts of an animal are functionally linked to each other. So if an animal has teeth that are designed to eat meat, for example, its digestive system must also be designed to digest meat, and its limbs and everything else fit the function of a meat eater. So you can't change one part of an animal through evolution because it'll no longer fit the overall function. So Lamarck refused to believe in extinction, and Cuvier refused to believe in evolution. Of course, both of them were wrong. Lamarck could imagine life changing and giving rise to new forms, but he couldn't imagine it suddenly ending. And Cuvier could imagine life suddenly ending in global catastrophe, but he couldn't imagine how new species could arise out of the wreckage. And I think it's still true today, as you guys have talked about, that what we're capable of accepting as scientific reality is unfortunately limited by how much of our pre-existing paradigm we're willing to give up. And that's true even for incredibly smart scientists like Cuvier. Paradigm shifts take time as new generations take the lead and are willing to accept new ideas. But in the end, even if we have to wait 180 years, we get the sweet payoff of knowing that at some point a giant asteroid smashed into a very surprised T-Rex and the wait was all worth it.
All right, everybody, it is time for our quiz all about paradigm shifts. So when I was making a quiz that was, supposed to be about paradigm shifts, I had to basically figure out what are paradigm shifts. So I went to the fount of all undeniable knowledge, Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And on the Wikipedia page for paradigm shift, there's a subsection examples. And those are the ones that I'm going to ask you about on this episode. Okay? So question 1. Antoine Lavoisier lived a life full of scientific impact. In particular, he developed a theory of chemical reactions and combustion that dismantled phlogiston theory and sparked the chemical revolution. But how did he die?
Could it be... Did he inhale so much oxygen that he just passed out?
Oh, I thought you were going to say he spontaneously combusted.
That would be great too.
If that were true, that would be an excellent trivia question.
Yeah.
Is it in any way related to his research or what he's remembered for?
No.
Okay.
But it's related to what we've talked about today?
Well, what it's related to is who he is and at what time he was.
Did he get caught between two paradigms and one shifted?
It shifted right over him. It was terrible. In a sense, it was a clash of socio-political paradigms.
Oh.
Was he a French revolutionary?
Yeah. Was he guillotined?
He was guillotined in the French Revolution.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
But yeah, so his theory of combustion may have been the spark that brought a chemical revolution to a head, but the French Revolution took his. So he was accused of tax fraud and also with watering down the nation's tobacco.
Son of a bitch.
He was
Out here vaping. Ugh. This guy.
Yeah, so he was beheaded by guillotine, and his colleague, this is actually where I might need some help from you, Andre. I think it's Joseph Louis Lagrange.
Oh, that was wonderful. I thought you were
Okay, now you're just showing
replaced
off.
by a French person there.
Yeah, oh, perfect. Okay, so it's like Joseph Louis Lagrange.
Yeah.
Okay.
Joseph Louis Lagrange?
Yeah,
Probably.
exactly. Hi, I'm starting to doubt you now. Are you really Canadian? All right. But Joseph Louis Lagrange said, it took only an instant to cut off his head, and 100 years might not suffice to reproduce its like.
Wow.
Which is pretty nice.
So they're reproducing his head. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And then 100 years later in Madame Tussauds,
they finally reproduced his head. Which is sad, obviously. It's sad that he died, but at least the French people could rest assured in the knowledge that their tobacco went unadulterated.
But it would be weird if he was still alive, though.
Yeah. Except that a year and a half later, he was exonerated by the French government. And his belongings were returned to his widow with a note that said, to the widow of Lavoisier, who was falsely convicted.
Oh, no.
Which is like scant recompense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sort of an implicit criticism of capital punishment at all, right? Anyway.
Lavoisier came up during my research on Cuvier because
they're both French.
Yeah, no, but because Cuvier wanted to establish kind of his field of research, like anatomy, as like having scientific laws comparable to what Newton had discovered with physics and what Lavoisier had discovered with chemistry. He wanted laws of biology that were kind of determined how all biology had to work. So Cuvier's focus on like functional kind of anatomy and how like an animal had to have all these parts that work together in a logical way. He wanted to create this system just like Lavoisier had done for chemistry. So I think it's interesting that you brought it up.
It's interesting that like when Darwin was like, oh, I have this idea, maybe like you could even say it's a law. We'll stick with theory for now about like how evolution works. He was like, no, only I could come up with laws about biology.
In fairness, Darwin came later than Cuvier. So Cuvier was just talking to Lamarck, and Lamarck, we all know Lamarck. Yeah,
I see. Okay, I thought you were saying
Reputation
Cuvier
precedes him.
and Lagrange were contemporaries, but I see now. Okay. All right, question 2. Andreas Vesalius was a 16th century anatomist and physician whose fully illustrated book on human anatomy, De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libri Septem, on the fabric of the human body, overturned the received anatomical wisdom of what ancient Greek thinker?
Hippocrates?
I don't know any other Greek doctors, so
Yeah.
that sounds about right.
Well, on what makes up a human body, and so who did we do a deep dive on? Who wrote about like the childbirthing process and like how poop is sour? Was that all Aristotle?
Those are my facts about Aristotle. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like he would have written like the kind of the Aristotelian view of the human body would be the predominant one. So I would say Aristotle.
Cool.
Final answer? The answer was Galen.
I was reading about Galen. Yes, for my fact. Yeah.
Galen said basically lots and lots of stuff about medicine that essentially nobody dared question until Vesalius. This is about 1,300 years later. He did a lot of his own research into like the history of medicine about like trying to learn about Galen, and he rediscovered essentially that all of Galen's dissections were done on animals, which was not known. But when Vesalius published this like really well illustrated anatomical treatise that was like very widely distributed, that was like a huge turning point in medical anatomy. Question 3. Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz are credited with inventing the physical and mathematical concepts required to describe the motion of bodies under the influence of a system of forces, i.e. classical mechanics. However impressive his mathematical pursuits, Leibniz dabbling in philosophy inspired French author François-Marie Arouet to pen what novella satirizing Leibniz's overly optimistic take on the problem of evil?
So a novella by a French dude that makes evil seem like sartorially very simple.
Oh,
it's like Voltaire.
Voltaire. Voltaire was the author.
So then that must be Candide.
The answer is Candide, yes.
Okay.
There we go.
Got it.
Okay.
So François-Marie Arouet, possibly, is Voltaire, and Voltaire wrote Candide. And a common refrain whenever anything unspeakably horrible happens in Candide is for a character to say, "This is the best of all possible worlds," which is a reference to Leibniz's like philosophical viewpoint on like even though bad things happen, because there's a benevolent God, this is the best possible world he could have given us, so everything's fine. And basically Candide was just like a big middle finger to Leibniz. Which is interesting.
Wow.
And Voltaire, actually, we've mentioned in a previous podcast, it's interesting because what was her name? Mary Toth or something? The woman who like pretended,
I think so.
Pretended to like give birth to rabbits to, for fame and possibly money, etc. That whole affair, which like so ashamed doctors in England, was used by Voltaire in like a couple essays to argue that England was not actually an enlightened nation. So it's interesting that he's come back a couple times. He was just a really snarky guy.
I'm trying to imagine being like a physicist and having a writer like Voltaire just shitting on you.
Just go full turbo on you.
I'm just trying to do like physics and understand the world, and I have like a famous writer who will live on in perpetuity just insulting and degrading
Well, I
me.
think
How sad.
I think, and I'm not going to pretend I know so much about this that I can offer my own Voltairean critique, but I think that it wasn't the physics that Voltaire was taking issue with. It was like the sort of half-baked worldview, like philosophical worldview / religious worldview.
Happy-go-lucky.
Yeah. All right. Question 5. In 1879, linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, also maybe, proposed the laryngeal theory. That is the idea that there are a series of phonemes existing in sort of ancient languages that beyond those that can be reconstructed using the comparative method. The comparative method is basically like taking known languages and with the assumption they all had to descend from like a common ancestor language. Using what is similar about them to like recapitulate what that earlier language must have been like. So he basically proposed that there were what are known as laryngeal consonants. And I think that basically those are consonants that have what are known as a place of articulation. So if you try to make a sound and really think about where your tongue is in your mouth, basically the place of articulation for these is toward the back of the mouth. And that it was not possible to get these from the comparative method, basically. So this was confirmed by the discovery of a language known as Hittite. And the theory is about what sort of like ancestor language to many languages that we have discussed before.
Proto-Indo-European?
Yes. I'm sorry, that was my last question that I wrote.
Wait, was that the answer?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
I was like,
I talked about like comparative language reconstruction a few episodes ago.
I was running out of Wikipedia paradigm shifts, and I was like, how do I make this a question? And like, the answer is Proto-Indo-European. Basically,
Woo!
he was essentially saying it was not possible from like sort of standard linguistic methods from the known languages to reconstruct all of the phonemes present in ancient sort of like predecessor languages that are sort of in the Proto-European root.
So it's like a theorized like
right.
common language among them to account for those unaccountable differences.
Right. So question 6. By looking at a lot of galaxies, Edwin Hubble contributed to the Big Bang Theory by providing the first observational basis for the expansion of the universe. Later, the telescope that bears his name, the Hubble Space Telescope, took an image known as the Hubble Ultra Deep Field of a rectangular region of space about 2.4 arc minutes to an edge or 3.4 arc minutes diagonally, which is smaller than a 1 square millimeter piece of paper held at 1 meter away. If you're looking at the sky and you hold 1 millimeter of paper 1 meter away from you, that's the amount of sky, basically, in that field of vision that the Hubble Ultra Deep Field was looking at. Approximately how many galaxies did it see? So you can give me an order of magnitude.
It's 10,000.
Fucking nailed it.
Really?
Almost exactly.
Is that
Almost
right?
exactly 10,000.
Damn.
I was guessing entirely. I was waiting for Rob and Emily to correct me on that one.
That was
Absolutely
fantastic.
nailed
That
it
was-
right on the head.
that was
Don't even
amazing.
need to dwell on this tiny, tiny, tiny piece of sky. Yeah, all right. Great job, Andre. All right, keeping it moving. Now the show won't be too long.
Yeah.
All right, question 7. In archaeology, the use of LiDAR to remotely image cultural sites is considered a paradigm shift. What does LiDAR stand for?
I think it's something distancing and ranging, which is like most of the DARs.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so it's probably like light interference, distancing
yeah.
and ranging, but I don't know. It could be. I feel like this is what they used to find like the putative site for Troy when they were like walking around Turkey, and they were just like, oh, here, like there's a thing under here. Distancing.
Let me see if I can make it easier. It's not always written like this. I found it's really.
Oh, is it
The I is
capital
actually
L,
in
lowercase
the
I?
Li is light. I'll tell you that.
okay?
Oh, okay. So.
Also, the D might not be distancing because I'm pretty confident on the end ranging, but that also might be totally wrong.
No, that's right. And so it's light,
Okay.
blank,
Okay.
and ranging.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh.
so close.
Blank and ranging?
It's got to be something like depth in ranging.
Nope. Well, okay, it's fine. I feel like you guys basically have the concept. It's light detection and ranging. So it's using light to detect and range.
Can we all say that's a dumb acronym?
I mean, you can say it. You heard it here first.
Detection and ranging. Why not just say detection? I mean, what's the difference between detection and ranging?
Well, because you want to know. Because
Oh.
the whole point is to figure out how far things are away.
So just detect how far it is.
No, you have
You
to
already have
range how
detection in
far it
there.
is. You have to detect the object
Nah,
and
you just-
range how far it is.
Well, I think it's a matter of opinion, but I think you should just call it. Just skip all the acronym. Just call it D. It's just detection, and all the details are details.
Okay. Well, I'll run that up the flagpole and.
Thank you. This is my opinion.
Okay, so the answer is light detection and ranging. It is actually very, very cool, and it's probably of all the ones I've mentioned, it's probably the most recent. I would say so it's quite interesting if you read about if you just Google LiDAR and archaeology. There's really interesting stuff happening. Like basically, you can produce what are high resolution, what are known as digital elevation models or DEMs, which is an acronym I guess that Andre would approve of. Because it starts with D.
Just call them models.
DIMS are high resolution.
Models do.
So they can produce these high-resolution digital elevation models of archaeological sites that can reveal micro-topography that is otherwise hidden by vegetation. Some recent uses of this that are quite interesting, particularly in Central America. So in 2012, LiDAR revealed that the Purépecha settlement of Angamuco in Michoacán, Mexico, had about as many buildings as today's Manhattan, which is like way more than were previously thought. Like they're their society and their cities was so much more complex and like more built out than we're aware of. I was reading a little bit. It's used in Egyptology as well to discover sort of previously unknown archaeological sites, and it is basically accelerating the discovery of the global cultural past, which is very, very cool. So
Nice.
My favorite question and favorite fact, which I promise I will use in a future episode fleshed out. Question 8. Renowned naturalist Charles Darwin gained fame for his work as a naturalist on the second expedition of the HMS Beagle, which naturally resulted in his work on the origin of species and the theory of natural selection. My question to you is, true or false? Was Charles Darwin the official ship's naturalist for that expedition?
gotta be
Ooh,
false,
false. He was trained as a doctor, or tried to be, but couldn't stand the sight of blood. So perhaps he was on for that, just not very effectively. Poor guy.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like you've used the word natural so many times, and that it's your favorite fact would make it a clear false.
Okay, you're going with false? Okay, all right.
False with the story there.
All right, it's false. Okay, you're saying it's false. Now, I'll give you a second choice now. You can decide how I'm going to decide whether or not what you've told me is true or false. And that is, in your opinion, is the official ship's naturalist the person who held that position at the start, or the person who held that position for the most amount of time?
Start, right?
I mean, on the charter, it would be the person at the start. Kind of like... So, like, I'm thinking of this from a colonial kind of perspective. The Beagle leaves England, And the Queen, looking at all of her many charters, is like, who is the naturalist on this ship? And
Perfect.
she sees
That's
it
a new
says,
one.
someone. You didn't know I had that in the repertoire, right? But,
No.
You've been
she
holding
sees-
out.
Easy on my toes.
This is your
just-
1830s voice instead of your 1930s voice.
Yeah. But she says, I see it's this man. Oh, yes, not Darwin.
Oh my God. Is the Queen
In
on
reality-
this podcast? That's crazy.
But like the ship's out, and then the other guy dies or whatever, or sucks, and Darwin's like, well, I'm a better naturalist anyway, and so he is in fact the naturalist. But if you're anyone in England, he's not.
So you're saying the worst naturalist died out and a better naturalist took his place. Kind of like natural selection.
A naturalist that was more.
Naturalist selection.
Well, I gotta say, this is great reasoning, because if you think the naturalist that starts the expedition is the official naturalist, then it is false that Darwin was the official naturalist. What was my question again?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes. So if you think that whoever starts out as the official naturalist is the official naturalist for the expedition, Charles Darwin was not the official naturalist.
So we got it right then.
You guys got it
Yeah.
absolutely right. Now, Dunk, did you just... Okay, so I learned something that I am very happy to share with
A
you.
lot of dunking today.
And it's that Darwin wasn't an official anything on this boat. This was a naval science expedition. Darwin was a private citizen who was essentially had been invited there to keep the captain company, because in the Royal Navy it was frowned upon. In fact, it was not just frowned upon, it was not allowed for captains to fraternize with like subordinate people. And so sometimes these expeditions that would go out for a really long time would have a companion ship, so like the captains could hang out. This was not sent with one of those. And so he was really concerned about the isolation. It would end up being a 5-year journey. So you got to think about like
Wow.
the level of like social isolation that is. If you were in order to like keep the chain of command, you have to always eat alone. You can't like have a friend that is like a naval.
Sounds like grad
Yeah,
school.
basically. So Darwin was kind of just there as like a companion who was interested in going because he was he was interested in science, right? And he saw the like the opportunities that would like present to him. And in fact, I read a little bit about how like Darwin had like an interview with the captain, and he like, whose name I'm just blanking on. Oh, it's Fitzroy. The captain's name is Fitzroy. And he had this meeting with him. They were like both in their 20s. They really like vibed during this meeting. And sort of the original like gentleman companion of the captain like had to back out. And so Darwin got to go along. And Robert McCormick had like all these, who was the official ship's naturalist / ship's surgeon. So he was the ship's surgeon who also was responsible for like the naval science, collection of species samples and stuff. And he had a lot of ideas about how this was going to be his big break. But the presence of Darwin there, who as a private citizen didn't have any like shipboard duties, meant that he was allowed to like just disembark and go off on land and like go down some river and like meet up with the ship later and collect a bunch of samples. And so he rapidly was like outpacing Robert McCormick's own scientific collection, and he just could not handle that. So only 4 months into this 5-year expedition, Robert McCormick basically claims that he was ill and requested a transfer. And this is a process known as being invalided. And so he disembarked at Rio de Janeiro and then took the HMS Tyne back to England. So what the best part, the cherry on top of this, and there was like a little bit of like competition between these two, especially when Robert McCormick, apparently they got along at the beginning, but then Robert started being kind of a dick, and then like Darwin didn't really like him that much after that because he was being so hostile. So Robert McCormick has to take the HMS Tyne back to England, which gave everyone on the ship, Darwin including, an opportunity to send some of his like mail, and for Darwin, some of his scientific journals and correspondence back to his sister for safekeeping. So McCormick has to carry the fruits of Darwin's labor that he had objected to so much to like bail out of this expedition. back to England, including a letter explaining from Darwin to his sister, which explained to her the circumstances of his being able to write to her. And he says, I take the opportunity of McCormick returning to England, being invalided, i.e. being disagreeable to the captain. And then it goes, he is no loss.
Wow.
Which is just like an amazing thing. And you would think, like, the best part about this is that Robert McCormick, like, is super bitter the rest of his life. Like, he tries to get on another expedition and go to Antarctic, never really manages to break through. So, like, to the end of his life, he was very, very bitter. And it's like, it's terrible. And I want to add that you think, like, he is no loss. That sentiment is like a massive burn, right? You might also think, if you're Robert McCormick, you're like, whatever, that phrase will fade away with history. I read the book, He Is No Loss, a biography of Robert McCormick, which is really interesting and where I got a lot of this stuff from. And I specifically want to mention that because, A, it's funny that it did not fade away. It's the title of a book. 2, I guess I went A to 2. So A to B, this is B now. This book is really cool, and it's actually a master's thesis dissertation that was published from a history of science master's student, Emily Steele at University College London, and it's all about Robert McCormick's life and his relationship with Darwin, and it's really, really, really cool and interesting. And her advisor, Dr. Joe Kane at UCL, in the science and technology studies, I guess, area, said of her, Emily Steele achieved the near impossible with Darwin by finding something new. And in a podcast that is like founded by graduate students, I just thought, we found something really cool that a graduate student found, and I thought that was worth highlighting and mentioning her. So it was very, very, very cool. And with that, that's our show. A big thank you to our special guest, Dr. André Pineda. Dr. Dre, where can our listeners learn more about you?
You can find me on Twitter at Dre the Scientist, where right now you'll mostly see me retweeting epidemiologists explaining what is going on right now. But I'd love to see more people talking about science and talk more about science. So find me there.
And if you want to learn more about us or get in touch with us about what you heard in the episode or to tell us what you thought was cool, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at FaxMachinePod and on Facebook at Fax Machine Podcast. And we're on social media. I'm at Arcs and Sciences. M.
At _EM Costa.
And Rob.
At Sweatervest SCI.
Fax Machine is produced by Noah Giberson, Rob Frawley, and Emily Costa, with editing by Noah Giberson. The theme music is by A.C. Antonelli, and our logo was designed by Mike Zola. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.